Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the Presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of John Quincy Adams, and the focus is petitions and slavery. The year is 1836. Adams is now in his third term as a U.S. Congressman in his post-presidential political career continuing along, and the hot topic of the day is slavery and expansion. This topic had been front and center when Adams had been Secretary of State to President James Monroe, 1819, 1820. During that period, when Missouri wanted to come in to the Union, they eventually settled on a compromise. Missouri came in as a slave state, Maine as a free state, but then they drew that line, 3630 parallel. Going forward, at least for the Louisiana Territory, anything north of that, slavery off limits. South of that line going forward, slavery was fair game. But now there was a new wild card. Texas was coming into the mix. Texas had just won its freedom from its independence from Mexico. It's now an independent republic, and there is talk almost immediately of annexing Texas into the American Union. John Quincy Adams was among those strongly against this for the very reason that it was simply going to expand slavery and the slave power even more, but obviously there were strong opinions on both sides. The one thing that the Southern congressmen didn't want to take anymore were all these petitions that were coming in from around the country to speak out so directly against slavery and its expansion, both the institution itself as well as expansion, and they were tired of hearing it. So Henry Pinckney put forward a proposal that would take these petitions and shall, without being either printed or referred, they would be laid upon the table, and that no further action whatever shall be had thereon. They were going to ignore in the House of Representatives all petitions related to slavery. Well, John Quincy Adams bolted out of his chair and was up in arms over this as an unconstitutional violation. He looked straight at that First Amendment, which guaranteed the right of petition to the government for a redress of grievances, and he found this to be completely unconstitutional. Well, he's shouting and others are shouting him down. James Polk is the Speaker of the House, and Adams gets into a shouting match with him as he says, "I am aware that there is a slaveholder in the chair." Cries of order, and Adams wouldn't be silenced. He came back. "I hold the resolution, Pinckney's resolution, to be a direct violation of the Constitution of the United States, of the rules of this House, and of the rights of my constituents." Again, cries to silence Adams were heard throughout the chamber. And finally, Adams stood up and said, "Am I gagged or not?" And in fact, he had been gagged. By a vote of 132 to 45, an overwhelming decision, the House silenced Adams and silenced petitions on the topic of slavery for the foreseeable future. Now, Adams' obstinance with this proposal was specifically about petitions, but it was also, of course, about slavery. So where did Adams stand on the topic? Well, he was not an abolitionist. He said at the time, "I can lend my hand to no project for the abolition of slavery in these United States without the consent of their masters." He joined, like most Northerners who were accepting of the compromises around slavery from the Constitutional Convention up until the present day, that slavery, where it already existed, was legal and should be tolerated, at least for the time being, but nothing about expansion should be tolerated. That's where Adams was trying to draw the line. And as he saw it, these issues about the petitions and slavery and Texas, it was all becoming intertwined. He said in 1838, "The suspension of the right of petition, the suppression of the freedom of debate, the thirst for the annexation of Texas, the war whoop of 2 successive presidents against Mexico are all but varied symptoms of a deadly disease seated in the marrow of our bones, and that deadly disease is slavery." He's not only against this petition gag, he's increasingly against slavery as well as these topics continue to come together. Well, Adams had an opportunity to lend himself to a legal case that was going through the courts about the fate of some 50 black individuals. This was the Amistad case. And what happened was there was a Spanish ship and some Portuguese slave traders who were sailing it, and they captured a little over 50 blacks in Sierra Leone, and they were transporting them as slaves to go to Cuba. Well, during this transport, these black individuals had an uprising, and they overtook their masters and their kidnappers, and they took over the ship. They were going to try to sail the ship back home. They didn't really know how to do that well. The ship was captured and it ended up in American hands. And the question was what to do with these individuals and what to do with the ship. Well, there were a couple of legal questions at issue. The first is, were the individuals, the black individuals, were they legally people or property? And the disposition of the case would be different based on that determination. The second question was, even if they were people, did they act appropriately in taking over the ship, or would they be considered pirates in terms of their action on the ships? These were the two legal questions that were being addressed. And a lawyer by the name of Roger Baldwin was representing the blacks who were in prison for 2 years while these cases were working their way through the American courts. And Baldwin had success, first at the district court level and the circuit court level. But the presidency of Martin Van Buren and his administration decided to take the case all the way to the Supreme Court. There was a lot of pressure from the South. There was also pressure from Spain because they wanted their ship back. And Van Buren said, let's let the Supreme Court decide. Well, before that case was finally tried in front of the Supreme Court, Baldwin and his supporters said, you know what, we need a heavy hitter. We need someone to help put us over the top and win this case in the Supreme Court. And they looked to the man who was so outspoken in the House of Representatives about all those slavery-related petitions and said, we'd like John Quincy Adams on our team. Well, Adams, who had tried a couple of cases in front of the Supreme Court before, but it had been many, many years ago, and he never had done much as a practicing lawyer. He embraced this opportunity. And while Baldwin presented the majority of the case, Adams came in for the final couple of days of argument, and he waxed nostalgic around American history, around perspective and context of the rights of blacks and slavery in the context of not only the United States, but the world. And he got emotional when he pointed not once but twice to the Declaration of Independence in that room, the thing that his father had fought so hard to bring this country into existence, and he had tears in his eyes talking about freedom and individual liberty in the context of these individuals whose fate now rested in the hands of the Supreme Court. Well, Baldwin and Adams were successful. The court agreed that because the slave trade had been abolished, the international slave trade was no longer legal, that these were in fact people, not slaves. And as people, they were justified in taking over their captors. They were not pirates, and they were to be freed. Well, Adams saw this as a tremendous victory, as did the supporters of these individuals, who said to Adams in gratitude that we feel and would hope you feel that a long life devoted to the service of your country has derived a new and holy luster from this noble effort in behalf of human life and liberty. Indeed, it was a compelling moment for John Quincy Adams. At the same time, a new president was coming on board, William Henry Harrison. And Adams was excited about this because Harrison was aligned with Henry Clay and in many ways Adams politically and philosophically about policies related to federally funded internal improvements and high protective tariffs, the American system, America first. This is what Adams believed the appropriate policies to be. And unfortunately, William Henry Harrison would have no time to put any of that into motion because he died 1 month into office. And his successor, John Tyler, well, ostensibly a Whig on the Whig ticket to take on the vice presidency, was really a Democrat. He was much more aligned with the Jacksonian political philosophy, and he was against all of these things that the Whigs, like John Quincy Adams, wanted to push forward. So he started vetoing things, and Adams and many of his fellow members of Congress were up in arms. They called Tyler a presidential nullifier with all of these vetoes, and they even put together some thinking around a potential constitutional amendment to limit the veto power. That's how strongly they felt about what Tyler was doing. They didn't get very far on that, and they would lose in the end to something that Tyler pushed forward, and Adams was not happy about. Remember Texas? Well, Tyler wanted Texas in the federal union, and he tried with the treaty, but the Senate rejected it. They did not get the 2/3 approval. So Tyler stepped back and said, you know what? Instead of a treaty, let's do this by a joint resolution of Congress. See if I can get a majority in both House and Senate to bring Texas in. And he did just that, just a couple of days before the end of his term. Adams was convinced this was going to lead to war, to a civil war, and he said, "I say now, let it come. Though it cost the blood of millions of white men, let it come. Let justice be done, though the heavens fall. If civil war is going to be what it takes to eradicate or stop the expansion of slavery and then eradicate it where it already exists," he was of the mind now that that was the right thing to do. Well, Adams, during this whole time of the Gag Rule, continued to introduce very provocative petitions, usually just so he could get shouted down and get into the ire of many of his Southern colleagues. At one point, he introduced a petition from former slaves that got everyone up in arms. Well, now he came up with the idea to introduce a petition, not his idea, but a petition from a citizen that actually advocated the breakup of the Union. The howls from all around the House of Representatives rained down on Adams, cries of treason against him. How dare you put such a petition in vogue here in the U.S. House of Representatives? And there was a move to censure Adams. Well, Adams basically said, bring it on. And the professor of oratory and rhetoric from Harvard University was ready for this fight. Thomas Marshall of Kentucky took the lead for the rest of the House, in particular those from the South. Now, Marshall had some courtroom chops in his family, as his uncle was Chief Justice John Marshall. But Thomas Marshall, the congressman, was absolutely no match for John Quincy Adams. Adams was defending himself point by point, frankly obliterating the arguments of Marshall. As soon as they came out of his mouth, he was fighting and attacking them, and Adams was winning at almost every turn. Eventually, after several days of this, Marshall basically gave up. I can't beat this guy. He withdrew the petition to censure Adams, and in fact, he said at the time, "I would rather die 1,000 deaths than again to encounter that old man." So Adams continued to persist. In some ways, it was a one-man fight, but he was going to keep fighting for the right to petition, and he was going to increasingly fight for the rights of slaves. Speaking of the right of petition, he finally got it back into play. His final personal victory on this topic came at the start of the 28th Congress in 1843. He had been introducing a resolution to get rid of the Gag Rule when every new Congress started. He never won. Until now. He tried again, he won, and he said at the time, "Blessed forever, blessed be the name of God." He was given this gift, this cane, which had at the end of it this gold seal, which said on it, "Right of Petition Triumphant." It was one of his prized possessions that he took to his grave, and he bequeathed actually to the American people. So he did have that final bout of success. Well, his career was coming to an end because his life was coming to an end. He suffered a stroke in November of 1846. After some convalescence, he returned to the Capitol, largely enfeebled, but he worked literally until the day he died. February 23rd, 1848, he was sitting at his desk in the House of Representatives when he suffered another stroke. He was moved to the Speaker's Lounge. Louisa arrived, and he died a few hours later. John Quincy Adams lived a historic life of service. He died at the age of 80. About 66 years of those years, the last 66, were in service to his country at nearly all levels. He was a teenager in Europe where he was helping his father and the minister to Russia. And as a 14-year-old teenager is when he had gotten his start. He became a diplomat in his own right for Presidents Washington and his father, John Adams. He was elected to be a U.S. Senator, the minister to Russia, the chair of the committee that negotiated the end of the War of 1812. The Treaty of Ghent had his signature on it. Secretary of State for 8 years, a momentous 8 years under President James Monroe. He facilitated the acquisition of the Floridas through the Adams-Onis Treaty, and of course had the major hand behind the scenes leading to Monroe's proclamation of the Monroe Doctrine to say, Europe, you stay out of the Americas, we'll stay out of yours. These were momentous times. Then he became President of the United States, perhaps the least consequential of his 4 years because he didn't get much done there. But he wasn't done. 17 more years in the House of Representatives, and he made his voice heard, particularly on these controversial topics around the expansion of slavery. Sometimes a lone voice, but that independent voice was loud and clear in the House of Representatives. Now, John Quincy Adams did not die a popular man like his father. Popularity didn't come with the mix of being a John Adams. Their upbringing was almost to be in spite of being popular. They were brought up to be completely selfless in the service of their community and their country. They could be ambitious, but if they had to make choices between the betterment of themselves and the betterment of their community or their country, they would take the back seat. They consistently made those kind of decisions. It didn't stop them from becoming president of the United States. Both did that, but they also struggled. They struggled to be popular. There's no monuments to these guys, in part because they did not court popular followings, but that would be okay. That was the world that they bought into. They were proud of it, and that's the life that John Quincy Adams lived until the very end. His dying words, "I am content," as he should have been after a lifetime of service to his country. That is John Quincy Adams and Petitions and Slavery from the life of John Quincy Adams. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.